everybody, welcome to another episode of Exploring Photography right here on Adorama TV, brought to you by Adorama. It's the camera store that has everything for photographers like you and me. Well, in this episode, I'm going to do a lighting setup that's wrong. Why would I do something that's intentionally wrong? Well, I'm going to do that because this is something that comes up in many of my workshops that I do in person, where people describe to me how they set up the lights and it just doesn't work. And specifically, it's when you're mixing Speedlights and studio strobes, or different brands of studio strobes, but it's usually, it's always when there's a Speedlight involved and you're trying to mix those two things, things go wacky and awry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set everything up in the way that seems like it should work, but doesn't. And then we'll take a few photos and show you that it doesn't work. And then we'll deconstruct everything step by step, and then we'll correct it and learn along the way, and then we'll have a fantastic image in the end. Now, to help me do this, I have a fantastic model. Her name is Kendra. Hey! And so, without further ado, we're going to get started right now. Well, the first thing we need to do is learn all about this lighting setup and the camera settings and all the things that I'm doing in this situation. So Kendra is on a stool here. We're going to do basic clamshell lighting, but I have 3 different types of lights set up. And so I have a Speedlight up here, and that is triggered by this little remote here. It's got its own flashpoint trigger. And then I have a B2 Profoto head that is triggered by a Profoto Air. It's one of these guys right here. And then I have an old school Profoto Acute 2 setup that's 20 years old. I still love it. And that is triggered by one of these guys, a Pocket Wizard. And so what I'm trying to do is to get my Speedlight to trigger my Profotos. And to do that, I need to set both of these into remote mode. So there's an optical trigger and they can see my Speedlight fire. And when that happens, then all the other lights will fire as well. And in addition to that, well, let me just show you how I have everything set up so you can sort of understand exactly where these lights are and how everything works. Let's start with the camera. I have my camera set to shutter priority mode at 1/500th of a second to freeze the motion. And because I have my shutter at 500th of a second, I have my remote set to TTL mode at high speed sync, so I can shoot at fast shutter speeds. I then have my Speedlight up here on remote mode, and so it will automatically be controlled by my transmitter on my camera. On my little B2 down here, I just have it set to manual mode. It's only a manual flash, and I have the slave mode turned on, so it will optically be triggered by my Speedlight. And then my old Acute 2 pack, I have it turned on, and also I have the slave mode turned on. So this is an optical trigger, and it will fire when it sees my light right there. So that should trigger that. And then what I'm doing here is I have 2 kicker lights on each side of Kendra. And so these lights are just going to add a little bit of sculpting to her hair and her shoulders. And then we have 1 light directly behind her. And so that light is going to be hidden by Kendra, but it's going to show up on the background as a nice vignette. And we should get a nice, perfect photo. Well, now that you know how we have everything set up, I want to walk through this step by step and show you the problems that we're going to have with this setup. Now, one of the big things that you'll discover as we go through this is it's inconsistent, because we have so many different auto modes turned on and we have competing controls that adjusting one thing to fix the problem might actually cause another problem. And it can be incredibly frustrating if you're learning how to do studio lighting and you don't understand what you need to do. So let's just start with no lights except our Speedlight. And so we'll start from there, and then we'll build one at a time and see those problems showing up as we go along. So again, I have my camera set to shutter priority mode, and I have the shutter speed at 500th of a second, which means that the camera is going to automatically figure out the correct aperture value. I have my remote controlling that Speedlight on high-speed sync at TTL mode. So that is wrong, but let me show you why it's wrong. So with just that Speedlight and my camera, let's take a picture. And so Kendra is going to look all so smiley. So good. And we look at that. This is not a bad photo. I like that. So the issue with that photo really is that we just need to add some light to fill underneath her chin, maybe add those kickers in, all those lights that we've set up for a reason. And so let's pretend that we don't know that this is wrong and start adding a light. So all I'm going to do is go here to this light, and I'm going to turn it on, and it's in remote mode, and it has an optical trigger. In other words, when this flash fires, it sees that flash and it also fires. So it will fire based on the flash firing. So it sees the light and triggers. Okay, so we're going to go over here and we're going to try again. So the only thing I've done is I've turned on that second light. And so Kendra's going to look at me, same smiley face, bam! And we look at that. There is no difference in those photos. And that seems odd. Why is that? This is about 75% of full power, which is much brighter than this light, but it's as if this light isn't even turned on. What is going on here? Well, there's a couple of things that's going on. Let's start with the first thing, and that is high-speed sync. So the way high-speed sync works is that this flash doesn't flash once, it flashes a bunch of times. And so to really understand high-speed sync, I've made videos about it. Gavin Hoey's made videos about it. Other people on Adorama TV have made high-speed sync videos. And so I've included links to those videos in the description of this video so you can do a deep dive on that. But number one, we shouldn't be using high-speed sync because this works with high-speed sync, but this does not. So let's eliminate that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go over here. I'm just going to turn high-speed sync off. Now we're on ETTL mode with this guy, and our camera has automatically gone down to 200th of a second because that's this camera's sync speed. Now, if you're not familiar with sync speed, it is the fastest shutter that your camera can use with the flash. And so again, I don't want to explain all of that in this video, but sync speed is something that you must understand if you're going to be doing studio lighting. I've included links in the description of this video to all the sync speed videos that I can find on Adorama TV. There's a bunch because it's a very important thing. But what we've done is ETTL at sync speed, which is 200th of a second. So now these two flashes should work just fine. That's what we think. So let's go over here. Now again, shutter priority mode at 200th of a second. The camera's going to try to figure out the proper aperture value, which is it's saying f4. And so let's try to take a photo, and blammo, what the heck? Again, inconsistent results. We just flipped. So now all we're seeing is this light. We're not seeing any of this light. What's going on? Okay, this is the point where a lot of people will email me, or they'll come to one of my classes and say, I don't understand what's going on here. These two things aren't working together. Well, the reason they're not working together is that TTL, ETTL mode. What is that? Well, ETTL is Canon's version, TTL, other companies, means electronic through the lens, TTL, through the lens, metering. So what's happening is when you have a speed light or a light that has TTL metering, this works like this. This remote control and the camera sends a signal to the flash, and the flash throws out a flash, a short burst of light. It's called the pre-flash, and it goes pow, and it bounces off the subject, and it comes back through the lens, TTL, through the lens, and then that tells the camera how much light is coming from the flash. And so then the camera goes, okay, this is how much light is hitting a subject. It's going to send another signal to the flash to tell the flash to either increase power or decrease power, whatever it needs to do to get a correct exposure based on the settings in the camera. It's really cool. And so what's happening in this situation, so it sends that signal, and then the shutter opens, pow, the flash fires a second time. So there are two flashes. The first flash, the pre-flash, to figure out the correct exposure, and the second flash, which is the actual exposure itself. those happen so fast that you don't even notice there are 2 flashes. But it causes problems with optically triggered flashes and metering. So there's 2 problems that are happening here at the speed of light. So let's dig into that. So with our pre-flash, this has fired, and because this is firing, this is fired, a bunch of light goes and hits Kendra. And it comes back through the lens, and the camera thinks there's a ton of light. And so it tells this flash we have tons of light, go to minimal power. And then when it sends the second signal for the shutter to open and these flashes to fire, this one fires at the same value it had before, and this one is almost completely at the very lowest power setting. And all we get is that campfire crazy looking light. And so that's what is happening there, is our TTL metering is messing everything up. So what we need to do is shut that off. Now there's another thing that happens with TTL metering, by the way. If you happen to have a correct exposure for whatever reason, what will happen? Well, let me just show you. We're going to go in here. We're going to take this camera out of shutter priority mode. Let's put it in manual mode. So now we're in manual mode. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to meter this since we have it in manual mode. Again, I'm still in TTL mode. And we shouldn't be in TTL mode, but I want to show you why we shouldn't be in TTL mode. So when I trigger this, it's making this flash fire. That flash is being seen by this flash, so they're both firing. So when I go over here and meter, so I'll meter this, that meter's at 5.6. But I know that's not the right value because that first flash is just sitting at a pre-flash. It's not the actual amount of light that's coming out because it's still in ETTL mode. But let's just try that out. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to set it down to 5.6. And we'll take a shot real fast. And here we go. Kapow! And again, all we got is the light from below, nothing from that top softbox. But notice in the second shot, the light below was exposed correctly, whereas in the first, it was exposed, overexposed. So we metered, and we got a correct meter reading, but only for this light, not for our key light, and that's the one that matters. I want this light to be around F10, F11. Why is that? Well, the reason for that is when we look in front of Kendra and behind Kendra, this is called depth of field, how much is in focus. And I want her to have lots of leeway, so about this much in focus, so that if she moves around, that it's not going to be a problem. And if I have my focus just a little bit soft, it's not going to be a problem. So when I'm shooting portraits, I normally want to be around F9, F10, F11, somewhere in that vicinity. And so that's another problem. This aperture value is not right. So much wrong with this lighting setup. So what we're going to do here is we're going to change some things again. So now I have this camera in manual mode, 200th of a second. That's our sync speed. But I don't want to be at whatever we're at, 4.5. I want to be around F11. And so what I need to do is I need to change this light. This light here can no longer be in ETTL mode because I need to intentionally tell it to be at a very specific value every single time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my meter and I'm going to change that from ETTL mode to manual mode. So I don't know if you can see that, but now I'm in manual mode. So I've just taken my remote here and I've told that to, I'm going to tell it exactly how much light I want it to have flash, so half power, every single time, no matter what. So we removed that whole loop of the camera telling the flash to fire once, going through the lens, telling it to fire at a certain value. We've removed all that. Now we're controlling everything intentionally, manually. So I'm going to say I want this to meter at F11. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go over here. I'm going to meter this light. And that meters right at F11, which is great because I set the power in advance so that we wouldn't take all the time in the world to set this up. So now what I can do is we've eliminated two problems. First, we've eliminated the problem of the exposure being incorrect, because now this is always going to fire at the value that I told it to fire at, which gives enough light that we can set our camera to f11. And then this light here, remember, we just wanted it to fill in those shadows. So we don't want it to also meter at f11. We want it to be at a lower value, and it is, because remember when we metered it before, it was, I think, 4.5, around there. And so it's just going to fill in the shadows, and we should get a good exposure. Let's see if that works. So now we're at 200th of a second at f11, and we're in manual mode, ISO 100. Our Speedlight is at half power. Now, yeah, I'll explain that later. So at half power, let's take a picture and see what we get. We get smiley face, and that looks pretty good. We have a shot that is working. So Kendra is exposed correctly. We've got some fill light, but what we want to do is we want to add some more light around her with these lights behind, add a vignette, and we can do that. But before we do, let me explain one other thing that can be confusing. So I have this at half power, and if you go into your studio and set your Speedlight at half power at f11, you are not going to get a correct exposure unless you're just lucky, because when we're metering and doing all this stuff, it's all relative. And so if this light was back maybe a few feet, it'd have to be at full power. If it was closer by another foot or so, it'd probably have to be at 1/8 of power. So don't take the exact values that I tell you that I've set my flashes to. Just meter the light and adjust your light until the meter reading is what you want it to be. So for me, it was f11, and so I just adjusted that until I got to f11. Okay, now, one other thing we're going to do here is we're going to turn on these lights back here. And when I do that, what I'm trying to do is give some nice highlights, and also this light here is hitting the background to get a nice vignette on the background, but it's going to change some things. The reason it's going to change some things is these lights are going this way. This is reflective. So these lights are going to go this way, hit this, and be reflected into our subject. So let me just shoot at the same value here. So let's just have you look right at me. Bam. And we can see that Kendra's hair is brighter than it was before, because the light from behind is hitting that little softbox, it's acting as a reflector, and it's coming in. And so that's another thing that works in our advantage in this scenario, but sometimes if you don't want the light bouncing around like that, you might have to control it with a grid or using some other way to say, don't fall onto that reflector. Or we have a big white wall here, it might bounce off that wall and going in, so you have to play with that. If you find yourself getting extra light and you're not quite sure why, then do this. Turn off everything else and just shoot with the lights one at a time, and you might discover that you have a reflection coming off of something that you didn't know about. Okay, so what we're going to do here is I'm going to meter the lights behind Kendra. So what I'll do here is I'm going to grab my remote. Now remember, this light is just firing. The light back here is seeing that light, and it's firing these lights. So I'm not controlling these lights from this other than to make them fire. And what I want to do is I want to meter the back of Kendra's head to see how much light is falling on us. So it's f5, so that's just a subtle bit of light, which is good. So the other problem that you might run into when you're starting out as a photographer is adjusting all the lights so that they all have the same value. So if I adjusted these lights so that they were at f11, well, then we would get too much light. We wouldn't have any shadows, we wouldn't have any light shaping functionality. We would just have tons of light, and we don't want that. So play in the studio with different values and different ratios between the key light, which is the main light, and all the other lights, and try to adjust them a little bit brighter, a little bit softer, and see what you get. Okay, well, now that we have our light correctly set up, we've gone now to manual mode, we've manually metered, we've manually set our key light, we have manually set our camera, we've manually set our aperture and our shutter speed and our ISO. All that's left to do is take some great photos. So I'm going to do that right now, and I'll show you the results. Well, those photos I think turned out fantastic, and we were able to take something that was wrong and step by step fix it. Thank you so much, Kendra, for being in this video. If you want to see more of Kendra's work and her photography and modeling and all that kind of stuff, check out the link in the description of her Instagram so you can see more of Kendra. And then also, don't forget to subscribe to Adorama TV. It's absolutely free. We're uploading new videos every single day. And so we have a team of professionals giving inspiration to you, helping you create no matter what. Thanks again for joining, and I will see you again next time.